Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kailey Leinz.
The Trump administration is watching the bond market, Canada, and tech. Welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz. The president punting on new Canadian tariffs that were set to go into effect today, and instead shifts his focus to a meeting at the White House this afternoon with the leaders of big tech and crypto companies. We'll get the latest from the White House from Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall and talk about the CEOs who weren't invited to this meeting, the ones that lead prediction markets, with the former governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie. Plus, we also have to talk about the Treasury's new, bigger buyback program for long-end rates as they look to put pressure on yields that have risen to the highest level in decades. We'll talk about Scott Bessent's move with Ira Jersey of Bloomberg Intelligence. We'll get into the results of yesterday's primaries as well, Florida and Alaska in focus. But first, let's talk about these financial markets and the bond market reaction to Bessent's move as we turn to Amy Morris here in Washington. Hey, Amy.
Hey, Kailey. Treasury is increasing the size of liquidity support buyback operations for securities dated from the 10-year to the 30-year sector by at least double. Now, the move is intended to rein in long-term borrowing costs from multi-year highs. That's what's kept U.S. mortgage and other borrowing rates high. The ramped-up buybacks are set to begin September 9th. This has all sparked a Wall Street rebound. We check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. S&P 500 up 0.3%. NASDAQ up 0.25%, and the Dow up about 0.2%. The 10-year Treasury yield now at 4.65%. The 2-year yield at 4.18%, and the aforementioned 30-year Treasury yield 5.19%. Crude oil moving higher. WTI closing in on $87 a barrel. Brent crude now topping $92 a barrel. A personalized vaccine developed by Moderna and Merck helped reduce the recurrence of melanoma in large late-stage trials. The trial met its main goal of showing that this vaccine, combined with Merck's immune drug Keytruda, reduced melanoma recurrences more than the immunotherapy alone. Moderna CEO Stéphane Bancel says it could be approved as soon as next year. Shares of Moderna now 141% higher, and Merck shares 11% higher. And Target shares are nearly 6% higher. Target lifted its full-year guidance after results outpaced estimates in the latest quarter, suggesting that Target may be moving past a lengthy sales slump. Target now looking for consistent growth following 3 years of declining revenue. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's go back to Balance of Power with Kailey Leinz.
All right, Amy Morris, thank you so much. Watching the markets for us, markets that do not have to adjust to a new reality of a stricter tariff regime on one of the United States' largest trading partners. At the very least, not yet. Remember, as of 10:14 p.m. last night, there was a very real chance that those 50% levies on billions of dollars of Canadian goods would go into effect at midnight. Then at 10:15, the president announces a punt on Truth Social, writing, quote, "I have paused the 50% tariffs against Canada that were scheduled to kick in tomorrow morning for a 3-day period, based on the fact," the president says, "that Canada and the USA, subject to the finalization of documents, have a deal." And now the Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, is weighing in as well, saying on X that Canada entered these discussions with the best overall trade terms. We are now moving towards an agreement that reinforces that Canadian advantage, including by securing the best terms in each of Canada's most important strategic sectors. And as we consider the path toward a final deal in the next 3 days here, we turn to Bloomberg Washington correspondent Tyler Kendall, who is live at the White House and had a chance to question the president directly about this earlier today. Tyler, what did he tell you?
Well, Kailey, at this point, as you're outlining, we're getting optimistic talk from both President Trump and the Canadian Prime Minister. But the one thing that we're still missing are those details, those key details on what is actually going to be in this agreement that ultimately caused this White House to stop its intent to impose some really punishing tariffs, up to 50% on nearly $20 billion worth of Canadian goods. But as you mentioned, I had the chance to ask President Trump directly to see if we could glean any sort of details on what may be in that agreement. Can you give us any update on your negotiations with Canada for a trade deal?
Yeah, we had a very good conversation with the Prime Minister last night, and we've come to a deal with Canada. As you know, the 50% tariffs across the board were going on against Canada today, and they called yesterday and they gave us the points that we had to have. Very fair deal for both. It's good for everybody. But our farmers are going to be thrilled. Our manufacturers are going to be thrilled. And basically, we have no tariffs going into Canada anymore.
Kailey, there's a few points of context here that we should provide. One, these 50% threatened levies were going to be under Section 338, which has never been used before, but does give the president authority to issue tariffs up to 50% if the U.S. feels that a country is discriminating against U.S. commerce. But I will say that perhaps the more stickier part of trade negotiations between the U.S. and Canada comes down to those Section 232 tariffs over national security concerns related to autos and lumber. I followed up by asking the president if we could expect any sort of a lowering of the rate when it comes to those levies in particular. And he seemed to nod at the fact that there may be some movement. He said things still need to be finalized, but that ultimately the U.S. needs to give some things in a negotiation too. That's how the deal is going to work. So that's something to keep your eyes out on as we try to figure out what the agreement is really going to look like.
All right, Tyler, we'll let you go in a minute. I know you got to get back into the White House because an important meeting is going to be taking place in just about an hour. The president meeting with a number of tech and crypto executives in particular. Tell us what we should expect.
So, Kailey, this is being billed as sort of a preview to a CFTC summit tomorrow that is going to focus on some of those top issues related to crypto, digital assets, and also prediction markets. There is reporting that prediction market CEOs will not be in attendance for this. It is going to be more of those CEOs related to crypto. We're still waiting for a final confirmation list. But, Kailey, I don't need to tell you at this point, we are closely watching what the Senate is going to do when it comes to that market structure bill, the Clarity Act. September 15th is the day that we are expecting that vote to happen, but it's not a done deal, and that is going to leave open big questions about regulation for the industry is going to look like going forward.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to your coverage from this afternoon. President Trump slated to speak at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time on that. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House for us. Thank you so much. Now, as we were talking to Tyler, we did just get a red headline crossing the Bloomberg terminal pertaining to the $16 billion 20-year auction we just saw from the United States Treasury. More issuance. And as we consider the takedown, it did draw a slightly higher yield than the presale when issued yield of 5.199%, drawing instead 5.204%. This, of course, follows the big announcement from the Treasury Department earlier today as Scott Bessent, just 2 weeks after having released the buyback schedule for this quarter, announced that for long end yields, 10 to 30-year duration, they're going to at least double that. A move, perhaps, to address the fact that yields at the long end had been surging toward multi-decade highs. We hit the highest level since 2007 on the 30-year yield earlier this week. So let's talk more about that now as we turn to Ira Jersey, U.S. rate strategist for Bloomberg Intelligence. Ira, as we consider the Treasury's move today, is this simply a tactical one, or does it address the fundamentals at all?
It does not address the fundamentals one iota. It really is, I think, just an acknowledgement that, hey, yields are higher than we want it to be as an administration, and we only have a few tools that we can really use, particularly in the short term, in order to try to stop yields from moving significantly higher. And so they took their shot. Now, what's interesting about this whole thing is not so much that they did it, because actually we had thought that there was the possibility that this would happen, but it's that, like you said, they didn't do it at the quarterly refunding announcement 2 weeks ago. They did it kind of on a, relatively liquid midsummer day, right? Instead of a couple of weeks ago, we're waiting to November.
Yeah, timing, as they say, is everything. Also, of course, coinciding with a day at which they were auctioning off more debt that falls into this duration category. $16 billion of 20-year bonds sold. Ira, how should we think about the takedown?
Yeah, it went okay. And in fact, we do this grading system from D all the way up to A+, and we gave it a B+ on our system, primarily because it had pretty good demand. Now, compared to where these bonds were issued a month ago or when the new bond was issued in May at the last refunding auction, yields are significantly higher, right? So I think the higher yields, and now the idea that maybe there's either going to be less bonds issued or some bonds bought back, it enticed investors to come in and buy a little bit. It wasn't exactly at the one issued, but it was close enough that that is kind of noise rather than anything major in terms of thinking about how this auction was taken down.
Well, of course, this was the big event for the bond market in the 1 p.m. hour. I wonder if anything you expect could be a catalyst in the 2 p.m. hour when we get Fed minutes. Ira, typically because the minutes are backward looking, not so much, but I wonder if this time may be different under Kevin Warsh with a September meeting and Jackson Hole, frankly, looming.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the discussions were, because you did have, dissents, and there was obviously some discussion about, a variety of topics that came up. So for the Treasury market, I think it's the balance sheet, and then, if there was talk about some of these task forces and some of the information that they've been trying to, that maybe some members want to provide to markets and to the economy, as opposed to Kevin Warsh, who wants to do less communication and, give somewhat less forward guidance. So I think any details that we get on that will be interesting. Probably not particularly market moving, at least not yet. But that could be pretty pretty telling in terms of what we might get in the future for balance sheet policy and the like.
All right, it's a busy day for a U.S. interest rates strategist, Ira Jersey, doing the hard work for us at Bloomberg Intelligence. Thank you so much. And of course, as we consider those Fed minutes later on and what they may signal about how the Fed is viewing the inflation outlook, that inflation outlook is very well likely to be shaped by the outlook for energy prices, which in turn are likely to be shaped by what does or does not happen in the Middle East. Because yes, we are still engaged with Iran in some fashion, or at the very least at a standstill with Iran over control of the Strait of Hormuz, a critical energy conduit and waterway. Recall yesterday at this time, we were telling you about the president's declaration that there are no ongoing or scheduled talks with Iran. So where does that leave us, and where does it leave the president's foreign policy overall? That's the question we now pose to former Ambassador Daniel Freed, Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he served as U.S. Ambassador to Poland, as well as the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. He's here with me now in our Washington, D.C. studio. Ambassador, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
If we could just begin on the Middle East and Iran and the president's suggestion that we're not talking to Iran, even though we should keep in mind his peace envoy, Jared Kushner, who was just in the Middle East, suggested that talks were ongoing. If we're not talking, is there ever going to be a real decisive end, any closure to this ongoing conflict, or will it be status quo indefinitely?
I'd keep my expectations under control. That is, the Iranians have little incentive in the near term to settle with the United States and allow the Strait to reopen. They sense they have an advantage because they see Trump basically thrashing around. And they're not interested in some sort of a deal. Our leverage will probably grow as time moves on. In the medium and especially the longer term, we do have certain assets. The Iranian economy is hurting. The regime is not popular. That's not going to help us in the short term. And if there's one thing we know about President Trump is his impatience. He doesn't do long term. But I tend to think that Jared Kushner is right. There are probably some contacts going on. Again, though, I wouldn't expect anything in the near term.
Well, we were told in the near term by the Treasury Secretary last week that we should be watching, potentially this week, for greater economic pressure on Iran, a suggestion that it was going to be unprecedented in terms of the degree to which it would cut Iran off from the global economy. I don't know if we should still expect that to materialize or be announced, but is there anything in your mind the U.S. could do, pulling economic levers that we have not yet, that would change the calculus for Tehran?
I don't think there's a magic bullet. And I think the Treasury Secretary was engaging in what Trump calls exaggeration, which means blowing things up and saying it for effect. Is there more leverage we could apply against the Iranian economy? Oh, probably. But I think they've got the workarounds pretty much in place right now. Our leverage is not great in the short run. It's better in the out years, but that's going to require patience.
Well, and as we consider the patience that might be required for this conflict, which, of course, the president initially said would only take a matter of weeks, he also suggested that ending a separate conflict, the war between Russia and Ukraine, would be a matter of days, a single day, if he were reelected. And here we are, obviously, with that war still ongoing. We spoke about this with President Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, on this program yesterday. And here's what he told us about the status of that war. Listen.
In the opening days of the war, some of America's foremost bipartisan national security experts came out and said that starting this war with Iran is going to help Putin because it's going to mean we divert Patriot missiles away from Ukraine. And Putin sees that. And so what's he doing? He's launching larger and larger salvos of missiles at Ukraine, knowing that Ukraine doesn't have the interceptors to be able to defend itself. We are leaving Ukraine naked to those kinds of attacks. And this, too, was very much both predicted and identified at the beginning of the war as a huge cost.
So when we consider that cost, and to his point, the relative defenselessness of Ukraine in terms of being able to withstand Russian missile and other barrages of attacks, does that mean Ukraine right now doesn't have leverage at a proverbial negotiating table? Not that anyone's heading to the negotiating table eminently.
Ukraine's odds of success in its war of national survival are a lot higher than our chances of success against Iran. You can see a success materializing. The Russian economy is weak. The Kremlin acts nervous about Russian society. The Ukrainians are very good at hitting Russian strategic targets using drones. And yeah, they're developing their own ballistic missiles. Now, you're right, and Jake Sullivan's right, that Ukraine is vulnerable to Russian ballistic missile attacks because of the shortage of Patriots. But the Ukrainians are going to keep fighting. They're not going to give in because they know the consequences of giving in is basically national extinction. We know the Russian plans. They will eradicate Ukrainian nationhood. They've pretty much said so. The Ukrainians know this. And what frustrates me is that a U.S. success, and Ukraine's success would be our success, it would help us a lot all over the world, is achievable. We are leaving perfectly good leverage on the table. The sanctions bill, the Graham sanctions bill on Russia has its drawbacks, its weaknesses, but it could be a useful tool. It's not perfect, but it's a decent tool. I hope we use it. There is more we could do to help Ukraine, and for God's sakes, we ought to be working with the Ukrainian defense industry because they're pretty good at this stuff. We need their expertise. They're also a provider of security. So if the U.S. would get a straight position on Ukraine, that we want them to prevail and lean into it, it would not be easy, but the chances of a decent outcome, a ceasefire in place with most of Ukraine free, which would be a big strategic defeat for Vladimir Putin, well, that's achievable.
It is remarkable to hear you suggest that Ukraine, which is making these things in garages and basements in many cases, is in a better position than the American U.S. military forces in the Middle East.
The Ukrainians' lives are on the line.
Sure.
And there's nothing like wartime incentive to speed up military technology. This has been a history of the world for a couple of hundred years. War produces rapid results in military technology. The Ukrainians have learned that lesson. We can learn it too. We can help them scale up. They can help us train. This is a win-win. And there are people in the Trump administration who understand this. But President Trump himself goes back and forth. We need to focus on success, and then the odds of achieving it are much greater.
Just quickly, we're almost out of time, Ambassador. If the House does pass that sanctions bill you mentioned, how quickly would it have an effect?
It could be implemented relatively quickly if the administration wanted to do it. Its effect on Russia's economy will take longer, but the signal will be strong and useful for American interests.
All right, Ambassador, good to see you. Thank you so much for joining us, as always. Ambassador Daniel Freed, the former ambassador to Poland now and Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, now Weiser Family Distinguished Fellow at the Atlantic Council, here with us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Stocks and bonds rallied after the Treasury announced it would increase U.S. bond buybacks to stop the surge in long-end yields. The Treasury plans to add additional liquidity support for its buybacks of longer-dated debt, causing a sharp rally across assets. 30-year Treasury yields now at 5.21%, 20-year yields at 5.2%. We do check all the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. S&P 500 up 0.25%, NASDAQ up 0.1%, the Dow up 0.1%, and the 10-year Treasury yield at 4.67%, the 2-year at 4.19%. Oil is higher. WTI crude oil now closing in on $86 a barrel. Brent crude just topping $92 a barrel. Marvell Technology has entered into a commercial agreement with Google to develop custom semiconductor products. Marvell issued Google a warrant to buy up to 58.97 million shares. Shares of Marvell are now up about 10%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Let's get back to Balance of Power with Kailey Leinz.
All right, Amy Morris following the money and markets for us today. Thank you so much. We, of course, also follow the money here on Balance of Power. We follow the money in politics. And if you were following the money in Florida yesterday, you might have thought that things would favor the retired Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman as he competed in the Democratic senatorial primary. He had a 10 times fundraising advantage on his opponent, $9 million in the bank relative to the less than $1 million that Angie Nixon had. And yet it was Nixon who came out victorious, beating Vindman by 12 points. This is noteworthy, not just because of the margin of victory or because of the money factor, but because Nixon is a member of the DSA. She will now be the one taking on the incumbent Republican Senator Ashley Moody in the general election in November. This is how Nixon framed that last night.
Ashley Moody and the corporate politicians in Washington, they like to label us. It's easier to try to make voters afraid of me than to defend the choices they keep making to make our lives harder. They look at this movement and they call us extreme. They call us radical. But I think people see through that. Yes, they do. I won't let them define me, and I know you will always know where I stand. With you, everyday people. Everyday hard-working people.
So let's get into that race and, of course, the results of the other primary elections that took place last night as we turn to our political panel. T.W. Arrighi is with me, Vice President at Push Digital Group and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic strategist Allison Jaslow, former White House Special Assistant during the Obama administration. Welcome to you both. Allison, I'll begin with you first as the Democrat here. As you just heard Angie Nixon say, they like to label us. I feel like there might be an argument to be made that she did label herself when she became a member of the DSA and therefore a socialist. Is she going to be forced to moderate herself if she wants to stand a chance against Ashley Moody in November?
I mean, that's going to be a personal choice. Advising candidates, they need to stay authentic to themselves. To win a general election, I think she should be mindful of the fact that she shouldn't take actions that would also make her vulnerable to not having the best chance to win the race. But this is also a seat where the Democratic establishment really struggled to recruit a candidate. You might be aware that the gubernatorial nominee is actually a former Republican in Florida right now.
Yeah, David Jolly.
This also was a reach seat for Democrats. So we'll see how things play out from this point forward. Obviously, this is a primary result that surprised a lot of individuals, but I also think that it was a much more complex situation than you see in maybe some of the top tier seats across the country.
Well, so weigh in on this, TW. If you're Ashley Moody right now, or if you're at the NRSC thinking about where it is strategically you need to spend money, are you about to spend a lot less of it in Florida?
No, and I saw one Florida commentator say Ashley Moody's prepping to put up Kim Jong-un-like numbers in that race. If you looked over at one of the congressional races with Jared Moskowitz, he beat his DSA
handily
opponent and said that at the core, DSA is un-American. These are people who want to abolish prisons. This is the platform of the DSA. Abolish prisons, abolish the United States Senate, free and open borders, et cetera, et cetera. That dog won't hunt in Florida, especially not statewide. This is similar to what happened with the Republican Party in 2010 with the Tea Party. The Democrats are experiencing that now. There are movement candidates on the far end of the party that are winning these primaries and going to fumble some seats that should be competitive. I don't think this Florida race was ever going to be very competitive, but it's playing out in other parts of the country, and that's going to come back and bite them in November. I still think it'll probably be a pretty good cycle for Democrats, but they're playing with a lot of fire here.
Well, just as you mentioned, Jared Moskowitz, he, of course, faces longer odds after Florida's redrawn map went into place, but do you think he actually has a chance of coming out on top in the Boca area?
I think it's going to be tough. Obviously, the redistricting helped Republicans quite a bit, but also Florida has been trending redder and redder every cycle that we've seen since President Obama was in office. And I think that will continue. He's clearly trying to moderate himself, and he has been doing that on Capitol Hill a bunch, too. He's created a lot of cross-aisle friendships, like with Tim Burchett, the conservative member from Tennessee. So we'll see what happens. But again, Florida isn't, I think, the focus of where the NRSC or the NRCC is looking coming in November.
Yeah, the NRSC might be more interested in spending money in Alaska, which also had its primary last night. Allison, obviously, this one is structured a little differently. The top 4 candidates, regardless of party, advanced to November. But it looks like the top candidate, at least in the primary result, the one who garnered the most support, is the Democrat, the former Congresswoman Mary Peltola, who will be really head-to-head against the incumbent Dan Sullivan in November, even though others will be on the ballot as well. How much are you heartened by the numbers she was able to put up last night?
Well, I would say as much as the Democratic establishment struggled to recruit in Florida, just the opposite happened in Alaska. I don't know if there's anybody who's more Alaska than Mary Peltola. You'll also notice, of course, 4 candidates are going to go into the general election, but Dan Sullivan, who's the incumbent, who also has another Dan Sullivan in the race running against him and Mary Peltola, there was a lot of focus on him and whether he should be in the race or not, the non-incumbent Dan Sullivan. But even if you combine the totals that both Dan Sullivans got last night, they both together don't beat Mary Peltola. And so I think it's a real bright spot on the horizon, especially, in a Democratic primary cycle that has been very unpredictable and challenging for Democrats across the board.
So how are you feeling about Alaska as a Republican right now, TW, seeing what Mary Peltola was able to accomplish last night?
Yeah, I think Alaska's a very quirky state.
Sure.
As Allison pointed out, 4 people make it to the runoff. I don't really understand why that's happening. The other Dan Sullivan is clearly trying to be a spoiler. He's propped up by Democratic groups. And in the congressional district, the House seat, there is someone who made the runoff who is currently serving a 20-year prison sentence and has never visited Alaska. That is shocking at its core. Mary Peltola is definitely a true blue. Last night was a great recruiting pickup for Democrats, but I would remind everybody that one of the main reasons Mary Peltola won her House seat is because of the infighting within the Republicans and Sarah Palin, who's a friend of hers, playing spoiler in that race. Alaska, I still believe, will trend red. He's a little bit soft on his numbers if you compare them to where they were in 2020. But you have to remember, in 2020, he won that race by 12.7 points. Dan Sullivan is not a radical. He's pretty well respected in that state. And I think at the end of the day, he'll come out on top.
I was speaking yesterday on Balance of Power with a strategist who happened to hail from Alaska. She was born there, lived there a lot of her life, and she said basically take any affordability challenge in the lower 48, and it is drastically exacerbated in Alaska just based on geography and how much has to be imported to Alaska, essentially. So I wonder if you see this fundamentally, Allison, as being affordability politics, which are obviously cross-country in this midterm cycle, as being even more prominently on display in that kind of state.
Well, it's also a state that I think is more globally connected in many ways, given the position of Alaska not being where the rest of us reside here in the contiguous, United States, that the economic policies of the current administration, I think, are applying unique pressure in places like Alaska that makes it a hard sell if you're a member of the president's party wanting to have, your job back in the United States Senate. So, I think a combination of sort of the brass tacks of the fact that people are trusting Democrats more as it relates to the economy and or the individuals who are going to actually be fighting to lower costs, but also having a unique candidate in Mary Peltola. You don't see this necessarily in other Senate races, but she is very Alaska. She is uniquely positioned to connect with the people there in a way that I think could be the secret sauce in 2026 for her.
I want to talk about another state which didn't have a primary yesterday, but does have a runoff next Tuesday. And there was a debate last night, and that's South Carolina. This is the race to fill the shoes of the late Senator Lindsey Graham. His seat, of course, is currently held by his sister, Darline Graham, who is running for it on a permanent basis. She was debating Congressman Ralph Norman last night. And TW, she was asked in the debate about Taiwan, the South China Sea, and a pretty general question about America's national security interest in that region. And this is what she answered. I quote her directly. "I'm just going to be honest here. I'm not on national security. I'm not that informed on national security, but I do support the military." Is that credentials for a United States senator?
Well, I am biased here. I worked for Senator Graham, for Lindsey Graham, and I know Darline personally, and I love and respect Darline Graham and the entire Graham family. That was obviously a very tough answer. At the end of the day, no one's going to replace Lindsey Graham in terms of foreign policy smarts and experience. Ralph Norman won't. Nobody else will. Pick a person. So it's big shoes to fill. Ralph Norman also doesn't exactly have a record of great foreign policy insights either. So we have to set the playing field where it is. Darline Graham has been in the Senate for a handful of weeks, has got a lot done in that short period of time. She's a bright woman, a capable woman. That was an unfortunate answer, and I don't really think reflective nor appropriate for that answer, for that response. There is nobody who's going to run for the Senate who isn't already in federal office handling foreign policy or have a military background that's going to be an expert on the South China Sea. Unfortunate answer. Wish it went differently, but I do think she's a capable woman who would be a good senator.
Well, I wonder your take on this, Allison, because it's one thing to be honest about areas in which you are not as well informed. It's another to say, either way, you should still elect me to be one of 100 members of the United States Senate. Was this disqualifying?
I mean, Charleston is home to a significant military population and is very important to our national security, especially our Navy. And, you know, I think that South Carolina deserves a senator who really gets that. You know, her brother certainly was very proficient when it came to national security issues and matters of, world affairs. And I think, disqualifying is something that the voters of South Carolina are going to have to decide. I think the more unfortunate story here is it looks like she will probably maintain her seat in the United States Senate. And are we a country that wants to hand down Senate seats, from family members to other family members? Or are we the country of the American dream where anybody can find their way in the U.S. Senate?
Well, of course, we've seen a few political dynasties in our day here in the U.S. We'll leave it there. TW, Allison, thanks for joining us on this political panel on Balance of Power on Bloomberg.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. I'm Amy Morris. Treasury Secretary is increasing the size of the liquidity support buyback operations for securities dated from the 10-year to the 30-year sector by at least double. The move is intended to rein in long-term borrowing costs from multi-year highs. That has kept U.S. mortgage and other borrowing rates high. The ramped-up buybacks will start September 9th. 30-year Treasury yield at 5.21% and the 20-year yield at 5.2%. We do check markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. The S&P 500 is up 0.25%. NASDAQ up 0.2%. The Dow up 0.2%. The Russell 2000 index up 0.5%. The 10-year Treasury yield at 4.67%. The 2-year yield at 4.19%. Crude oil also continues to move higher. At this hour, WTI nearing $87 a barrel and Brent crude now topping $92 a barrel. Bitcoin broke out of a months-long trading range, surging nearly 8% ahead of a meeting at the White House. President Trump is slated to be joined by executives from Coinbase, Payward, and Blockchain. Despite having an advocate in the White House, crypto industry leaders are worried about cementing those regulatory gains. They're pushing for passage of a landmark digital assets bill. Bitcoin now more than 5% higher. Estee Lauder posted quarterly results that beat estimates and ended a run of 3 straight declines in annual revenue. The company reaffirmed its 2027 full-year sales outlook and raised guidance on its adjusted operating margin, a key metric of profitability. Estee Lauder shares now 17% higher. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Amy Morris. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Back to Balance of Power with Kailey, Leinz.
All right, Amy Morris checking on the markets for us. Thank you so much. Amy will be back with another look at the markets at the top of the next hour, 2 p.m. Eastern time, when Bloomberg Business Week Daily kicks off. It'll be a big hour. As Amy just mentioned, there's also a big meeting happening at the White House in that hour as President Trump gets set to huddle with the executives from big crypto companies and associated lobbying groups as part of the kickoff for the CFTC's new Innovation Advisory Committee, which will hold its first official meeting on Thursday. It's looking at the agency's efforts on tech and finance and ways in which to guide and regulate those industries. Yet perhaps those not included in this meeting are just as notable as the ones that are. The crypto CEOs will be there. The CEOs of prediction markets will not. This, of course, is as the CFTC is trying to establish itself as the main regulator for prediction markets. A bit of jockeying happening here between federal and state authorities. And I'm joined now by someone who knows this very well and certainly has an opinion on these prediction markets. The former governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, is here with us now on Bloomberg TV and radio. He's an advisor to the American Gaming Association. Governor, welcome to Balance of Power. And I do want to get into the policy here with you, but can I just start by asking you first, are you glad to see that the prediction markets executives are not included in this White House meeting in this Innovation Advisory Group?
Well, Kailey, thanks for having me on. I wonder why they ever were, why President Trump would ever want to sit with these folks who now have been found to be operating illegally in states all over this country. They've lost 85% of the court cases that have been brought against them. And so, you know, the fact is that these are folks that are not going to contribute to the conversation, the potential success of the crypto legislation they're trying to get through. They're a drag on it. And I don't know why, between that and the president's teleprompter scandal, that all was predicated on stuff that was on these markets. I don't know why he'd want them there in the first place, and I'm glad he decided not to have them there.
And before we talk more about this, I just want to mention the breaking news just crossing the Bloomberg terminal as we are considering a deal on trade between the US and Canada. People familiar with the matter now telling Bloomberg that the US is set to cut in half the tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum as part of this trade deal, though they caution that that deal is still not yet finalized. We'll continue to track that for you here on Bloomberg. I'm sure there are bets somewhere out there on Kalshi or Polymarket, Governor, about whether or not there will be a trade deal between the US and Canada. To your point on what we saw with the teleprompter operator, you could point to the member of the United States military that was involved in the raid in Venezuela and was able to reap financial reward on that before he faced charges. When we think about issues like that, is that actually lending to the argument that maybe you do need to see federal oversight over these markets and who can do what, how they can operate, rather than it being on a state-by-state basis? Is the CFTC actually the right party to handle this?
They're absolutely the wrong party to handle it. And here's why. First off, any of these other issues that we've just talked about, while they're serious as individual cases, they're a distraction, Kailey, because between 80 to 90% of what the predictions markets do is sports betting. And they are sports books. That's what they are. And these other things are a distraction that allow them to make an argument. But in the end, these are the folks who, as we're getting ready to send our kids back to college, they market directly to college students and call what they do investments. Well, you know, a bet on the NFL is not an investment. And so while these other things, as individual things, the teleprompter case or the military matter, are serious individual cases, that's not why Kalshi, Polymarket, and others are in business. They're in business because 80 to 90% of their business comes from sports betting. They're sports books that are regularly evading state regulation. and they've been found to be operating illegally in many states. In fact, they're operating in a state like Texas, who doesn't allow sports betting of any kind. So these are illegal actors, and this other stuff, while important for those individuals, is a distraction to the overall issue, in my view.
Well, of course, you're familiar with the legal fight over sports betting and getting more states to allow it. That fight went all the way to the Supreme Court. And I wonder if you expect this one to as well. And given the court's current composition, if you feel like the court would actually be on your side on this one.
Look, I was the person who brought Christie versus the NCAA, which established the right for states to permit sports gambling if they chose to do so. That was a 6-year fight. I think this one will be shorter. And I believe when you look at it, 85% now, Kailey, of the cases, as I said before, that have been brought, the prediction markets have lost. And I don't expect that losing streak will do anything but continue if they go up to the United States Supreme Court on this. And if that's what the states need to do, that's what they should do. Because let's face it, they've already cost the states $1.3 billion in revenue, in tax revenue, that would have come otherwise to the states, that's being siphoned off by the activities of these prediction markets. That's serious business in these states. I can tell you as a governor, losing big revenue like that means either programs have to be cut or other taxes have to be increased. And that's only happening because of the selfishness and the illegal conduct of these markets.
I'd like to talk, Governor, if we can, about another issue that could end up before the Supreme Court. It's the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, Harmeet Dillon, told me this week that she'd be willing to take it that far. It's this fight over the DOJ trying to get access to states' voter rolls. And she pointed specifically to the state of New Jersey. Of course, the current governor, Mikey Sherrill, disclosing that there had been thousands of individuals misregistered as citizens and therefore as potential voters in New Jersey's systems. And this got to the overall question of non-citizens voting. This is what Harmeet Dillon told me, Governor, and then I'll have you respond.
Sure. I think the scope is actually much larger of non-citizen voting. And these are people who flagged themselves, according to New Jersey, hi, I'm not a citizen. And then they went ahead and voted. And so we don't know the scale of this problem because 2/3 of the states are refusing to cooperate with the Department of Justice's efforts. We would love for all the states to cooperate with us. But in the states that have cooperated with us, there are hundreds of thousands of dead people on the voter rolls, and there are tens of thousands of people who are not citizens on the voter rolls.
And I'm wondering, Governor, if you saw evidence of this in terms of non-citizen voting activity while you were leading the state of New Jersey, and if you were still there in the governor's mansion, would you be cooperating with the DOJ on this?
Well, a few things. First off, no, because the system that has helped to create this problem, where people are automatically registered to vote when they go to get a driver's license in the state, didn't happen when I was governor for two reasons. One, I didn't let non-citizens get driver's licenses when I was governor. And two, we didn't permit that type of automatic registration to vote. And the reasons at the time that I stated were because you could have errors like what's happened here in New Jersey subsequently when those laws were permitted. So I think they were bad decisions by my successor, Governor Murphy, and I think Governor Sherrill is now paying the price for it. I think the good news is that Governor Sherrill has hired my former Attorney General and former United States Senator Jeff Chiesa, a Republican, to lead the investigation in the state into whether there are more people who are non-citizens who are registered to vote and to fix the problem. And I have complete confidence in Senator Chiesa that he'll lead that investigation with integrity and honesty and disclose it. But I am also, as a former governor, very jealous about the rights of the states on voting. These are not federal issues, Kailey. This is for the states to take care of. And I don't think the DOJ should be involved in the middle of this. And I don't know what their motivation really is outside of political. In the end, the states should be doing this themselves. We did it when I was governor. And I trust that Senator Chiesa, now being brought on board by Governor Sherrill, will expose all this information to the public. And then the governor and the legislature will have to figure out how to fix it. But this won't be in the dark anymore. I guarantee you that Jeff Chiesa will bring it to light.
Well, to your point, Governor, on states being in charge of their own elections, it's not just the pursuit of voter information from the DOJ. They're also sending, according to Harmeet Dillon, or preparing to 1,000 election monitors across the country to different voting locations for these midterms. And I know you said you don't know exactly what the motivations are, but do you suspect that this could be gearing up all towards something that could be contesting the results of November?
Well, one never knows, Kailey, what could happen in that regard. But I will tell you this. There will be a fight over those monitors being at state polling places as well, because they've got to articulate a reason, a civil rights reason, why to have those folks there. And I can tell you, I don't see what that civil rights reason is. The DOJ will have to articulate it, because I guarantee you if they try to send in monitors into individual states, and whether they're red or blue states, it doesn't matter. Governors want to run their elections, not turn it over to the federal government. And quite frankly, whether it's been a Republican or a Democratic president over the last number of years, do we really think somehow the federal government would run elections better than state governments? I don't think so. And I think there'll be fights about that as well.
Well, speaking of a fight, not over the vote and the voting systems, but over an issue that people will be thinking about, I would imagine, when they go to vote, data centers, the NIMBY issue of this cycle, Governor, they seem to be. We're seeing more governors, including Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania just yesterday, taking action to regulate them, put restrictions around them. Others, like Kathy Hochul, have resorted to just a flat-out moratorium. As someone who was a state executive, you've run a state, how would you be thinking about the data center issue right now? How do you balance the potential economic opportunity they present with the challenges communities think they might face because of them?
Well, let's call the data center issue what it is. It's an energy issue, Kailey. That's what it is, because they use enormous amounts of energy. And in my state, for instance, energy costs, electric costs are through the roof. And they were the single biggest issue in the last gubernatorial race here in New Jersey. And the current governor is still struggling to try to deal with it. And as someone who receives an electric bill every month for my home, doesn't seem any better to me at the moment. And so what people are really worried about here is that if they're going to be data centers, that they need to pay for the electricity they're going to consume, and be able to do it in a way that it doesn't affect negatively the market for homeowners and other small businesses. And see their rates go up. And so that's really the issue here, more than anything else, is electricity and the use of electricity in those places. And so what we need to do is to figure out a way how the people who will be making a profit off these data centers, those companies, need to make sure that they absorb the costs that they put on these communities. And secondly, we can't walk away from the idea that there is going to be economic development and job creation by these. But as a governor, what I would attempt to do is make sure that the people who are creating these new market conditions, which could raise costs for homeowners and small businesses, that they pay to bring those costs down. And if you want to operate in a state, you need to bring those costs down. And then that helps to create that opportunity, will then create jobs, which will be good for the state and good for its citizens. But you can't just have the job creation and let electricity prices go through the roof, because if you do, that's going to harm small business, and that's going to harm regular citizens who are trying to heat or cool their homes. Those prices are already too high because of a whole bunch of things, including the war in Iran and some of the infrastructure problems we have in this country. So as a governor, what I would be doing is trying to make sure those responsible keep the market where it is, or even lower, for homeowners and small businesses.
All right, Governor, great to get your perspective on this and other issues as well, including prediction markets. The former Republican governor of New Jersey, Chris Christie, now an advisor to the American Gaming Association. Thank you so much. I do want to reiterate the breaking news. Bloomberg reporting that the U.S. will have tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum as part of a trade deal, which is not yet finalized. We'll have more on that in the late edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.